gate. Bigthanada and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on gallows. So just picture the story. Esther brought into the king's palace. Mordecai happening to be at the right time, at the right place, at the right time to overhear these guys talking about how they wanted to assassinate the king. He tells Esther. Esther gives him credit for it. They investigate it. They find out it's true. He gets rid of those guys. God was always working behind the scenes. Let's kind of shift a little bit to Act chapter 2. Act chapter 2, you can write this down. Honoring God can come at a price. Sometimes honoring God can come at a price. Even though God is behind the scenes, we don't always see it. And so sometimes in our life, our faith can be called upon to act in a way that may be contrary to anything you ever thought of. God might be asking you to do something that's totally outside your comfort zone. And so honoring God comes at a price, worshiping Him with our lives. Notice this on your outline. It says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman. Here's another person entering the story, a man named Haman. And he had elevated him and given him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So you see what's going on. This man Mordecai, he's given this high position in the kingdom, and the king says, everybody, you're supposed to honor him and bow down, and Mordecai refused. Now, I want you to notice this continuing on in our reading. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they had told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Now, remember, Mordecai was brought from another country into this king's country, and he was supposed to do what the king said, right? Like Vashti. You saw what happened to Vashti when she refused to listen to the king. So here Mordecai is saying, you know what? I'm not going to honor this man Haman. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to bow down. And the scripture doesn't really give us a whole lot of information other than to say, because he was a Jew. One of the things that I think about why we wouldn't is because, why? We should only honor God. We should only bow down and give service to God. No matter what happens, we should honor Him. And it can even come at a price. Now, notice this. In Esther chapter 3, continuing, it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So notice, God is working behind the scenes. And this man Haman, who wanted people to honor him, who was full of pride, when Mordecai refused to worship him and bow down to him, he said, I've got to do something about this guy Haman. So I'm going to get rid of him. And not only am I going to get rid of him, I'm going to look for a way to kill all the Jews. You know, I was texting this last week talking about this story, and I was mentioning that God was able to do some amazing things through this man who was willing to risk his life to stand up for what he believed. He goes to the king, Haman does, and he says, King, there's a group of people that live in your kingdom who refuse to do what you say. He's not going to do it, and they're not going to do it. So, King, I have an idea. This is what I think you should do. You should issue another decree so that on a certain day, at a certain time, all the people in the surrounding areas should totally annihilate the Jews. Let's get rid of them. That's one way to teach Haman. That's one way to teach anybody else who comes along who doesn't want to bow down, is what Haman was thinking. The interesting thing is he says this, you know what? By the way, King, if you do this, I'm going to make a contribution to your campaign the next time you run for office. He offers to give him some money as well as to do this. So the king tells Haman, keep your money. Let's go ahead and let's make sure that happens. Let's get rid of all of the Jewish people. Now, keep in mind, God is working through this story. He's working through the life of the king. He worked through the life of the queen. He worked through the life of her uncle. He's working through the life of this man Mordecai. And he's going to work through Esther. Now, notice this. Let's go to Act 3 in this story. Act 3. God is faithful enough to trust. Ladies, Esther was an amazing example of a woman who trusted God, of a woman who honored him, that even though she didn't understand what he was doing or why he was doing it, she continued to believe. Ladies, that's one of the great characteristics about being a woman. I don't know why it is, but a lot of times ladies totally outshine men in these areas. Guys, I don't know what to say about that other than that's what I've noticed. That ladies tend to trust a little bit more sometimes and to honor even though it can be painful. Ladies, Esther is a great example of a woman to be like. I want you to notice this. When Mordecai, look at the story, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He just found out that all of his people were going to die. That the king put it in writing, this is going to happen on this day. And so he goes out of the city and he rips his clothes as a sign of disgust and a total humiliation before God and just a total trusting of him. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, and in the Bible we find other people doing that as a sign of humility before God. God, this is all I am. He weeps bitterly, and it says, in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine the scene? They know that they're going to lose their life. And here they are praying, fasting, not eating anything, just laying there, just weeping. Now notice this. So Hathach went out to Mordecai. Mordecai told him everything that had happened. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go to the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Esther, do you know what's going on? Do you know what your husband just commanded? Do you know what he's going to do to our people? Esther, go to him and just beg for our lives, Esther. Now, think about this. You're the queen. But in the kingdom, the only way you could have a presence or audience with the king was if he called your name. If he said, you come see me. In fact, the Bible tells us that if anybody tried to go to see the king without being called upon, you were going to lose your life. And so Esther really struggled with this idea of, man, if I go to my husband without being called, and he hasn't called me for quite a while, I'm going to die. And she tells her uncle this story, and she says, you know, if I go see him, I could lose my life. Notice what he says in Esther chapter 4, continuing, it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Now, I want you to notice this answer because it's classic. I love this answer. He says, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. Esther, you think you're the queen? This goes for everybody. That goes for even you too. You're going to die too unless you do something. You have been brought to the specific time, and now notice this, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews